Good evening, everybody, and welcome to History Author Talks. It's good to see many familiar faces back with us again. And I am very pleased because I think we've got a wonderful show. Heading into the busy season here. Before we get started, I just wanted to tell you, first of all, as we move into the Memorial Day weekend, I'm getting revved up because I'm going to be the MC for the Princeton, New Jersey Memorial Day Parade. I always love doing this because I get to tell everybody about revolutionary Princeton. So that's a lot of fun for me. And then we have some events at the Princeton battlefield. And then on the following day over at Washington Crossing, we have some markings of the Revolutionary War soldiers' graves over at Washington Crossing. So Memorial Day is a very important day. Now, obviously, we are there to celebrate Memorial Day. So this is in honor, obviously, of those who have fallen, sacrificed their lives for our nation. So with that, I encourage everybody, as I always do, take a look at 10crucialdays.org. That's my nonprofit foundation organization that promotes heritage tourism in Trenton, Washington Crossing, and Princeton. So we hope you come visit us here in New Jersey. Now, for our program tonight, we have somebody very special. Full disclosure, I published Jean O'Connor's book. But I think that I'm very proud of everything that I publish. And I think this book is very, very special, as you will hear from Jean this evening. By way of introduction, Jean grew up in New England and developed a fascination for American history, evident of so many of the landmarks there. We have, just hang on one second. So her enjoyment in history as well as literature led to a teaching career in nearby Montana for 36 years, particularly in Helena, the capital. She's passionate about the meaningful learning experience for students and about working with teachers. Her work with the State Teachers Association led her to receiving the Montana Association of Teachers of English Language Arts Distinguished Educator Award. As an educator, she received the NCTE High School Teacher of Excellence Award in 2018, only one of 14 teachers in the country. And a few lines in her grandmother's journal inspired her to, in the interest that forms the basis for the remarkable cause, the story of James Lovell and the Crucible of Revolution. And with that, I am very pleased to introduce everybody to my friend, Jean O'Connor.
Hello, everybody. It is a very big pleasure for me to be here with you, and thank you for being here. And I also thank Roger. This is a great fun thing to do, and I have attended many of these talks, and I know how wonderful they can be. So I am very delighted to share with you tonight about The Remarkable Cause, a novel of James Lovell, and The Crucible of the Revolution. As Roger explained, I taught for actually 37 years, including 3 as literacy coach, taught on the Blackfeet Reservation, taught in a couple other places in Montana, but mostly in the capital, Helena. And I've always taught usually English, but I always tried to bring in history because actually literature is a reflection of history. If you're going to understand the literature, you'd better know why it was written. And it almost always goes back to the history. So I had an opportunity for a sabbatical, and I had discovered this little snippet of a story in my grandmother's journal that she had recopied. Her own grandparents had written it in 1892, and she recopied it for us because it was falling apart. And in this journal, I learned about the Lovells. And Master Lovell was a teacher, actually the head of the Boston Latin School for like 40 years. And his son, James, was a teacher with him, an under teacher. Now, this all was going on at the time the revolution was breaking out in Boston. And by that, I mean the conflicts that we're aware of, right? The Stamp Act and all the other things that followed that. And the journal hinted that there was conflict between these two. And they taught in the same square building, this big classroom. And being a teacher, I kind of identified with what they were doing. You know, they were each trying to sort out their path. They each had their own way of looking at what was going on. And they no doubt clashed a lot. I think we can all imagine, you know, having conflict with a coworker or a family member or such like that. And we have to get along. We have to be able to work out our differences to the point that we get along. And so I'm sure James and his father did that. I also think that the conflict, of course, boiled over past their ability to control it. But I have a feeling that as father and son, they tried to come up with a working relationship and did their best that way, even though they were on opposite sides. So then I learned about this story and I thought, well, I wonder if there's anything written about it. I wonder if there's any other novels or books that have ever been written about James Lovell. And what I found was the only thing that had ever been written was a doctoral dissertation by Helen Jones. She finished it in 1968, and it's quite scholarly, and most of it has to do with his time in the Second Continental Congress. He served there for 5 years as Secretary of Foreign Affairs. He introduced Lafayette and many other French officers to the Congress. But that wasn't what I was interested in. I was interested in his time in Boston while he was gaining his footing as being part of the revolution, while he was learning about what things he could do as part of being a proponent and a member of the Sons of Liberty. And that's what the story I wanted to tell. And no one had ever really written that story. So I applied for a sabbatical and I was fortunate enough to get it. And once I had done that, I went to research. And the story just kind of began to pull together. And all the details that I was searching for gradually came together until I knew that I could tell the story. And it was a fascinating experience. I do have a bit of a slideshow to show. So I think I'll go ahead and do that now and share my screen. And this will help us get a sense for some of the exploration and research that I did. Here we go. There, you can see that, I hope.
Yep, we can see it.
All right. So again, I am a recipient of the NCTE High School Teacher of Excellence. I was very happy and honored with that. And a Montana Distinguished Educator from our State Teachers Association. And I have contributed a piece on James Lovell to the Journal of the American Revolution. And Knox Press is my publisher. Thank you, Roger. This piece at the bottom showing James Lovell's handwriting, his signature, and the date, September 21st, 1775, is authentic. I actually have a letter that he wrote. And the way that happened was really interesting. I had done my research. I had written my book. It was out there. Roger was in the process of working through it. And I got a package in the mail from my sister in Minneapolis. It was a large square cardboard package with lots of insurance on it. And I opened it up, and there is a letter that James Lovell had written to his sons while he was in the Boston Stone Jail. And the letter says, "Dear boys, please take care of yourselves. I know you're helping my friend Oliver Wendell in the country, but I really want you to take care of yourselves. And remember that I'm always thinking of you. Act as though I were there with you," and so on and so forth. A very kind and loving letter. And this was just a piece of it. Now, yes, there were cracks in it. Yes, it's been folded up in an envelope for many years, but it was legible and it was really a neat find. And then I recognized that, yeah, I'd already read this letter written by a scribe. I had gotten it from the Clements Library in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And they had sent me a copy as per my request. And it was the same letter, but not written by James Lovell, copied by a scribe. So I wondered, how did that happen? And I contacted the Clements Library, and they said, oh, we're not sure how that happened, but it's pretty neat. And if you want us to house it for you, we'd be glad to do that. So I may do that at some point. I think that'd be a good thing to do with it. However, I think maybe what happened was that Helen Jones, the doctoral student who did research his life and wrote about mostly the latter part of it, went to the house, may have talked to somebody there, my grandmother, and may have then gotten permission to make a copy. But I don't really know. One of those funny mysteries that you end up kind of enjoying. So this is the journal, one of the journal pages that had given me the idea. And there are a couple of funny sentences in here. One was that James was a Whig, and while his father talked loyalty to the king at one end of the Latin school, he inculcated liberty and rebellion at the other. And I thought, wow, that's certainly an image, isn't it? How could you imagine? What was the school like? What might the boys have heard who were students there? And he later was honored with the first anniversary. He was asked to do the first anniversary address in the colonies on the event of the anniversary of the Boston Massacre. So that was another interesting thing. And then finally, here is a kind of a quaint way of looking at the facts. While his father went to Halifax as an honored guest of England, James was taken as a malignant rebel and spy and kept in close confinement. Now we know that those loyalists that left Boston were not honored guests. Yes, they were under the protective arm of England, but once they got to Halifax, life was not so cozy. There were hardships, there wasn't much food. They had a struggle just to survive, and many never returned home. So out of fear of their countrymen's reprisals, they ended up with a much harsher life, as it turned out. Still, this story really fascinated me. So I traveled to research institutions, including Harvard Houghton Library, the Library of Congress, the Massachusetts Historical Society, the Harriet Irving Library in New Brunswick, Cornell, and the Nova Scotia Archives. And again, the pieces just started to flow together after I kept asking questions and questions. We know that the troubles with Britain began as James Lovell was growing up in Boston. He was born in 1737, and of course, he would have lived through a lot of the early difficulties. And of course, Ben Franklin warned the colonies they would have to work together. It would not survive in this woodcut of 1754, very famous, published in the Constitutional Courant. He attended the Boston Latin School where his father had taught since 1738. And there is the square building that is the Boston Latin School, one of the earlier pictures of it, on the south side of School Street. It was founded in 1635 as the first public school in our country. Of course, the boys were the ones that attended school in those days. Girls, I'm hopeful, many of them were taught some reading and math at home. His father was Master John Lovell of the Boston Latin School. This is a portrait at Harvard. I've received permission to use it. And James did turn out to be a good student. He earned a scholarship to Harvard. His father could never have afforded to send him there. This beautiful booklet is titled A List of the Boys Who Were Educated at the South Latin School in Boston from 1734 to 1774. It was available at the Massachusetts Historical Society. I took pictures of almost all the pages within it, and it is Master John Lovell's book. He taught many who became well known in the struggles with British power, and you can see these names in there. These include Samuel Adams, James Baldwin, John Hancock, Henry Knox, Robert Treat Paine. Just imagining all these people who were proponents of the revolution and people who aspired to liberty being in the classroom of Master Lovell, who is essentially a loyalist. It's, of course, a very interesting way to examine and look at the events of that time. I wondered what was taught at the Boston Latin School. This is from one of the earliest composites of information about the school in those days. It was essentially divided into 4 classes, and the books were mostly Virgil, Cicero, Homer, and other classics, along with grammar. Lots of English and Latin and Greek. So they learned to read, write, and speak in English, Latin, Greek in those days, and they gained a good understanding of grammar. James, after finishing graduate school at Harvard, became a teacher at the Boston Latin School with his father, and he married Mary Middleton, who was of Scottish descent, and they have a family which grew to 9 children. This is a picture from the Boston Latin School today. You can see the name Lovell circled along with other well-known names. I received this picture from a person who helped me. He was Malcolm Flint, and he was the assistant headmaster at the Boston Latin School at one point. And he read the manuscript in one point and was kind enough to give me some thoughts about it. The Sons of Liberty, of course, arranged for many protests against the Stamp Act. One of the earlier, not the earliest, but one of the earlier affronts to their own control of their payment of taxes. James attended meetings of the Sons of Liberty. He is one of the 300 Sons of Liberty who dined at the Liberty Tree Tavern in Dorchester, Massachusetts in August of 1769. Those names being written on an alphabetized list that you can find at the Massachusetts Historical Society website. Now, I think he probably didn't attend all that many meetings because, frankly, he was busy. He had, a teaching job. He couldn't just take off and go to meetings all the time. But I think he did attend some, and he became a friend and acquaintance with many of those that were prominent in that movement. We know that Master John Lovell supported the policies of the British, including taxes. In the book, I tried to explain how Master Lovell might have talked. He might have explained many reasons to James why they should pay taxes. After all, the British were defending them. Those soldiers were expensive, and you have to have soldiers to protect yourselves. And yes, we should be honoring our responsibilities as good citizens and paying. But James disagreed. He agreed with the Sons of Liberty, so they no doubt argued, as I have said. Trouble between the townspeople and soldiers erupted in the event known as the Boston Massacre. 5 townspeople are shot on March 5th, 1770. I imagine that James would have explained this to his own children at home. He would have read from the newspaper. He would have explained to them what was going on. He would have made them think as to what the actual conflict was all about. And he might have talked to the boys at school about it as well and gotten their opinions about it. I think that he may have attended some of the trial that occurred in the following October. And I think he probably would have brought his sons, the older ones, to some of that trial as well. The townspeople were reading the manuscript that had been put together, a short narrative, which were the depositions of the witnesses. And I think James would have been familiar with that, and he might have talked with that about that with his students. So the whole thing, became an exercise in public civil discourse, and it gave the people in the town a sense of what was going on, so that by the time the trial happened, people weren't quite so upset and they weren't quite so concerned about the details because they had read the depositions of the witnesses. Kind of took the edge off things. James Lovell agrees to present the first anniversary oration to commemorate the Boston Massacre to the town. His father, Master Lovell, objects, but James is undeterred, and he speaks in the Old South Meeting House to a full house. And if you go there, there is a plaque that explains where he spoke from on the first anniversary. Following Bunker Hill in June of 1775, James Lovell was arrested for spying, taken from his family and thrown into the Boston Stone Jail. We have this clipping from the Virginia Gazette from August of 1775 that Master Lovell was taken up and put in jail, which was in consequence of some letters found in Dr. Warren's pocket, and Master Leach also. So these letters apparently, which were found in Dr. Joseph Warren's pocket after he was killed, implicated James Lovell in spying. It was a great hardship to him that while he was in jail in the Boston Stone Jail for 9 months, he was never officially charged with anything. He was just held. And that was a hardship. We do know quite a bit about his time in the jail from journals that were left by other people. Peter Eads, the son of Benjamin Eads, the printer, left an excellent journal explaining lots of things that were going on. And also John Leach, who was a navigator. They were both in the same cell as James for quite an extended period of time. And James was apparently very sick during this time. His stomach was not cooperating. He couldn't digest things. He was in great misery. And again, it's kind of neat. We don't have to imagine these things so much as knowing that that's what happened because of the record of the journals. Of course, following that period of time, James and others are taken by General Howe up to Halifax when the British evacuate Boston in March of the following year. And they take all the Loyalists with them. And that's when he ends up in jail in Halifax for another 9 months. So it's quite a story. And lots of things happen to even while he's in Halifax that are worthy of reading about. I think that it's a story that I think it speaks to us on a lot of levels. I think that it is one that people that are perhaps not terribly familiar with the revolution and what was going on can learn from. I think a book club would enjoy it. And I think you might find that if you went to my website, you'll see a study guide, research links to suggest ideas to people that would like to delve into it more. And also there are questions at the end of the book that might be useful to a book club or another venue for thoughtful discussion. So
that's
yeah.
terrific. Well, thanks for that overview. Jean, I appreciate it. Of course, having read the book several times, I got entranced with many of the characters, which I'd like to talk about a little bit later on. But first, I wanted to reinforce to everybody, if you have questions as we move through this, you can use the chat feature at the bottom of your screen and send me questions, and let's, we can talk about James Lovell. We can talk about the beginning of the revolution, the dichotomy between father and son or families. This was a civil war. Of course, we all know that. This was, and there were fascinating relationships that had to choose sides during this whole period. Here's my first question to you, Jean. What makes this book relevant today? I mean, what in reading this novel, and before you answer the question, this is a novel, okay? And for everybody who is listening, it's a rare type of novel. I mean, you have a 6-page bibliography and 16 pages of footnotes. You don't find a lot of novels with 16 pages of footnotes, but Jean's research was really absolutely quite remarkable. So while you're reading a story, and of course, all books are stories, whether they are fiction or nonfiction, Jean turned this into fiction, coming from her experience as an educator. And that's one of the things that I think is so fascinating about this. She's talking now with the Museum of the American Revolution. She gives teacher seminars. She was up at Fort Ticonderoga. She was talking with them about giving some seminars to teachers on using literature to teach history, which I wholeheartedly agree with. I'm not sure I agree with throwing Moby Dick at 7th graders, but you know, this is a little bit different. So let's get back to my question though, Jean. What makes this relevant? Why do we in 2022 go back and try and understand what was going on in Boston in 1774 and 75?
Well, I think that our struggles and desires today for liberty and freedom and rights are very important, and just as they were back then. You know, you could say that, you know, the people in Boston were just a little bit unreasonable, how they refused all these taxes and so on, but you can also say that they were holding hard to their rights that they thought they deserved to have as Englishmen. And those same rights are the ones that we want today. We want to have freedom. And we think about, you know, our democracy and how it's somewhat fragile, and how we have to work with it, how we have to support it, how we have to have the ability to speak up for what we think is right. I went to a presentation. It was actually a series of performances to benefit those in Ukraine last night. And one of the points that was made was that those people are struggling for their freedom. They want democracy. They want the right to govern themselves. Well, this is kind of where we are. You know, we know that long ago, people wanted that right to govern themselves, and we can recognize that, we can respect that. And I think we need to recognize that and hold on to it, because it's difficult today to find a voice and to be able to express what you think is right. But at the same time, you can do it, right? You can stick up for what you think is right, and you can be kind as well as open to other ways of thinking and other ways of looking at things, while you're still maintaining a stance of reflection and firmness for what you believe to be right in terms of our freedoms. And that's all very important. You know, they had a lot of protests back then. Those are reflected in the novel as well. And I know that we have protests today, and we need to respect and listen to those as well.
Mm-hmm. So I don't know if he's going to be angry that I call him out here, but my good friend and eminent Revolutionary War historian Mark Lender is with us this evening, and he asks the question. He says that he's just read Woody Holton's biography of Abigail Adams, and he thinks that Lovell was just crazy about her. What do you think?
Oh yeah, well, following the publication of the Remarkable Cause, or while that was in the works, I began researching his 5 years in the Second Continental Congress. And I was absolutely blown away. It was so much fun. It was so interesting. And what he does is he signs on, he goes with John Adams only a month or two after leaving prison in Halifax. And he is with the Second Continental Congress for 5 years, during which time he is he's the Secretary for Foreign Affairs. So he writes to Ben Franklin, he writes to John Adams, he writes to Arthur Lee and anybody else over there that needs to have communication, he decodes. He knows how to read cipher. He knows how to figure out the British cipher system, and he does on a number of occasions to benefit the Congress as they're trying to figure things out. And he makes a friend of Abigail Adams. He makes a real friend of her. And that kind of happens because he kind of sees, I think he sees her as somebody who is learned. Her husband has great respect for her. He's a good friend of John Adams. She is learned. She is not afraid to read. She's not afraid to speak her mind. So he kind of takes her under his wing a little bit. He sends her a copy of a map that is in the press. He hand copies it, and it's about the area around Chesapeake and so on, where the armies were kind of edging here and there, so that she would understand it better. And then when John Adams goes over to France, he becomes indispensable to her. And she writes him over and over, what's going on with John? How can you help me understand this? I really am worried about him. And he writes and he sends her copies of the journals of the Continental Congress, and he does everything he can to kind of make her feel better. However, he does kind of, and you can't help but see it a little bit. He does flirt a little bit. I guess I can only say it's that way. He says things that she finds to be inappropriate. And I guess I would have to say that is because he didn't know any better. He'd never been corresponding with a woman that was actually intelligent enough to write him back and understand pretty much what he was doing. And I think he just got a little bit excited about it. Like he would say things that were just a little bit inappropriate. And she would call him on it, and she would say, no, you must not write me that way. And so he would stop, he would apologize. And then later on, he would do it again. But what is really interesting is if you read these letters, there is a point at which he is suffering. He's injured. He falls, has a terrible fall. He is very poor. He has not gone home in 5 years because his family needs all the money he can send to them. And he really needs a friend. So he says, Abigail, I'm sorry, but this is how it is. I really am hurting here. And this is how it is. I don't know how else to say it. I just want to do the best I can for my country and my family. And
So-
she says, okay, yeah.
So does he
Yeah.
does he ever have any correspondence with John Adams about this?
Yeah. Well, yes and no. I mean, he says to John, I've just sent your wife this letter. I've sent her the journals. She seems to be fine, that kind of thing. Yeah. And once John does tease him back, he says, well, I'm glad that my wife isn't any closer to you than Braintree, Massachusetts. Right. But, John understood. And I think, when he does get home, eventually after his 5 years, he finally leaves the Congress. He goes home and his wife encourages him. You need to write Abigail. You need to tell her how you're doing. So he does. But he does it kind of half-heartedly, as if to say, well, that chapter's over and I'm home. I'm happy. So, it's kind of interesting.
That's great. Thanks, Mark, for that question.
Yeah.
Barry Singer, who is another good, wonderful public historian and does marvelous presentations, has asked another question, which is the subject of quite a long debate you and I had, Jean. Why did you choose the novel format?
Oh, yeah. Well, I like that a lot. That's a great question. I think that there are many people that find history intimidating. Now, maybe they didn't have a good experience growing up. Maybe they didn't have a great history teacher or two. Maybe their parents didn't take them to museums, or they didn't travel, and so on. And they don't get a whole lot. In fact, reading an actual history book would be hard for them, for a lot of people. But when you give it to them as a historical novel, they recognize the truth in it, and they can dig they see the history happening, and they learn that way. Many people, I think, actually learn the history of whatever it is by reading novels. And that's meaningful to them. I think that our duty as somebody that writes historical fiction is to make it as close to reality and what really happened as possible. Because a lot of people are going to take that as pretty much face value. And so, on the occasions when you do have to make up something or you have to embellish a bit, be careful with it. Try to make it so that it could have happened, but don't take away from the facts. Keep the facts out there, because I think that's really important.
Well, as
Yeah.
public historians, we're very careful, particularly when we're digging back into the 18th century,
Yeah.
to call ourselves historic interpreters. We are interpreting history. Well, as historic interpreters, or tour guides, if you will, we are taking the best scholarship that we know and trying to present it as a story. But of course, we don't know, we don't know for sure. Many of these pension records and diaries and are conflicting. So that in and of itself is interpretation. So you are, in a sense, just taking interpretation to a little bit different level to engage your reader. I mean, that's how I felt about it. I mean, the reason why, and I say this to the audience, when Jean first came to me with this book, this was a debate that we had probably for 3 months. I kept asking you, why don't you make this into a biography instead of a novel?
I think as an English teacher, I have always found that literature speaks to me in a way that, yes, I know I love to read history books, and I do, but but literature speaks to me in another way. And I think that there's a reason for that. I think that we feel the humanity of the people. If you can put yourself in their places, and if you can realize what they probably were experiencing, what they were feeling, what their struggle was, even little things that related to their family and so on, and their characters and so on, you're looking at a real sense for what people had going for them at that particular time in history. And that's important to me.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about the characters. I mentioned this earlier. I mean, this is The Remarkable Cause, a novel of James Lovell, but it's a lot more than just James and his father. Tell us more about some of the other Lovells and some of the people with whom we meet in The Remarkable Cause.
Well, one of the fascinating things I found, I kept finding tidbits of stories that just kind of embellished it and made it so real, One of them had to do with his brother, Benjamin, a younger brother who was a loyalist. And after Bunker Hill, James found out something interesting about his brother. He had a sister too, Elizabeth, a little bit younger than he. And Elizabeth had been hanging out with a British colonel, Colonel Cleveland. And they had been, he had seen her walking with Colonel Cleveland in the market after Bunker Hill. And she had convinced the colonel, well, not convinced, but perhaps suggested to the colonel that he hire his brother Benjamin as commander of ordnance, which he did before Bunker Hill. And as a officer in charge of ordnance, Benjamin, unfortunately, ordered the wrong size of cannon before Bunker Hill. Well, that no doubt did not play well, and it no doubt limited the British ability to shoot their larger guns, because as the story goes, he ordered 24-pound instead of 12-pound cannon. Now, I don't know that much about cannon, and I could know more, I'm sure, but what the story says is that 12-pound does not do the same thing as 24, and 24 is a lot smaller, which I didn't really research to figure it out, but That's apparently the story. And so Benjamin was fired from being commander of ordnance following Bunker Hill. Later on, he manages to get himself into the British Loyalist troops. And so he continues to serve with that until he ends up going to England. There he becomes a minister. But, the whole thing was kind of funny where Elizabeth kind of laughs in the book about how she was talking to her friend, Colonel Cleveland, and he, perhaps she had suggested to him that he do hire Benjamin. And yeah, I don't really know how that happened, but seems like maybe Benjamin did kind of make a mistake there. And, she kind of is a little bit coy about it in the book, because I think maybe something did happen where she suggested that he would be quite competent, perhaps knowing he wasn't so competent. And again, you have to read into it a little bit, but maybe she did know he would not have done such a great job. There is also a couple of verses of song that are handed down that the British regulars were singing following Bunker Hill. And this is on page 175. Our conductor, he got broke for his conduct. Sure, sir. The shot he sent for 12-pound guns were made for 24, sir. There's some in Boston pleased to say, as we the field were taking, we went to kill their countrymen, while they their hay were making. For such stout Whigs I never saw, to hang them all, I'd rather, for making hay with musket balls and buckshot mixed together. So, you get these little pieces of story that have come down that kind of make you think, well, yeah, there was something to that, perhaps. Maybe Elizabeth was doing her part in convincing them to hire her brother.
That's great.
Yeah.
What about Mary Middleton?
Oh, Mary. Oh, goodness, what a lady. She is a woman of her time. She was not well educated, but I see her as being very competent home caretaker, mother. When James is in prison, she works as a cook for Dr. Gardner.
This is James's wife, by the way, for everybody.
Yeah, James's wife. Excuse me. I should have made that clear. She works as a cook for Dr. Gardner, the one that brought the smallpox vaccine to Boston, vaccinated many people. And that helped her get by because she needed help in those years or those months. But Mary was brought up by a mother that was Scottish and a father that was a stepfather. Her own father had died. And she, I'm sure, knew a lot about cooking and taking care of things. She makes it pretty clear, or rather, I should say, the impression you get from reading James's letters when he refers to her is that she does not really care to learn about the details of public service or politics or anything like that. It's just not within her realm. But she does love to hear from him when he is working at the Congress. And I think she manages really well. When he is gone, she has another child is born while he's in prison, and she has to take care of all that as well as the whole group of children. James himself has a child. This is another interesting thing about him. He has a child before he marries Mary Middleton. And the mother of that child died in childbirth. And he makes apologies publicly in the church to those that are in authority to say, well, I'm really sorry. And that's how that went. And he undertakes to help raise the child who becomes James Jr. And he tells Mary this when they get married. And she agrees. Yes, that's fine, James. We'll take James in when he's a little older. So he stayed with the grandparents until he got a little older. But I think she was a remarkable woman for that. I know that growing up, her name gets passed down in my family, Mary Middleton Lovell. And in our case, that became a Loring. So I've got like a teaspoon with MMLL on it because James was a 4 times great grandfather. And so Mary Middleton Lovell Loring was a name that I was familiar with, for a long time. And so Mary Middleton Lovell becomes, I think, a very staunch revolutionary person who is capable, who is devoted to her family, who is needed to hold the family together while he is gone for so long.
That's fascinating. So now you did just a ton of research on the Boston Latin School. And I mean, you could have written like a history of the Boston Latin School, which is, I mean, part of that is in this book. Tell us about the education of young lads in
well, one of the
period.
really interesting things I found was that, as a teacher, you get involved in assessment, right? Assessment. Well, if the assessment can be a test, it can be an essay, it can be a writing, it can, whatever, quiz. One of the ways that they were assessed was they memorized like a speech, an oration, a short oration. And the Boston selectmen came and listened to the boys give their speeches. And if you did well enough, then, they would probably note that you had passed or that you had done pretty well on your particular oration. So, that whole practice of speaking was something that was ingrained in them, and it was something that they all knew how to do. And so when they were growing up, they did that in the school. Another thing I imagine, and to some extent it was brought out by the research, was that every day Master Lovell let the school go by saying "deponete libros," meaning put down your books. And when Lexington and Concord happened, he told them that right away. And that meant this time we're done. We're done for now. We're not going to have school for a while because it's not safe. And I think that, if they were having marches outside the school, such as protests, for example, protesting the impressment of sailors, of townspeople to be British sailors against their will. If that was going on outside, I think he might have kept all the students inside, not let them go out. Another piece that I remember is that General Haldeman, who was a British general there, was having his he did not, he was putting into the street something that made it difficult for the boys to sled down this nice hill. And the boys, I think, throwing ashes in the street or something like that. And the boys made a delegation, and they decided to, speak their piece. And they came up to General Haldeman's door, and they said, "Sir, we have always used this hill, this street as our sledding place. Can you please refrain from throwing your ashes out here so that we can continue with our practice of sledding where we like to sled?" And he said, apparently the general commented later, "Well, all right, they got their way. And, if everybody in these colonies were as forthright and determined as those boys were, I think we will soon see what stuff they are made of." So, they were representative of the ability to speak and to think for themselves.
So Mark asks us, why isn't there, I mean, with such a fascinating characters as James Lovell, why do you think there's never been a full biography? I mean, he didn't have a good publicist, right?
This is a good question. I don't know. I think one of the reasons, here's one of the reasons, possibly. In the time of the Second Continental Congress, when Congress had to abandon Philadelphia and go to York, and you have that conflict with General, who am I thinking of? General
Conway.
No, no, yeah, yeah. The supposed um uh,
The cabal.
yeah, the cabal. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
I mean,
Um,
which
yeah.
of course,
So
yeah.
James liked that general. He liked him. He stood
Thomas
up for
Conway
him.
and yeah.
Yeah, Conway, but not Conway, the general that disagreed with Washington, whose name is right out of my head. I'm so sorry.
Well,
Who am I
there's
thinking of?
yeah. Um, well, you have Gates and
Gates. That's what I'm thinking of. Horatio Gates. Okay, so he liked Horatio Gates. He had made a friend of him. He wrote him lots of letters. He thought he was a great leader. And when he had that strong friendship going, and there is the supposed plot or something to undermine Washington, he looks like he's on the wrong side. In actuality, I don't think he was on the wrong side. I think he was using his mind to try to make the right decisions for the country, whatever that was. And it might be that some people looked at him to say, oh, but he was turning against Washington. He was for Gates. But if you think about it, they were just trying to do their best, those people in Congress. They had no notion that Washington would be the one that would actually hold everything together. They were trying to do their best to figure out who would be the best general here. And just because Lovell liked Horatio Gates doesn't mean that he was totally wrong in supporting him. He was trying to use the facts at hand.
so he and I've had some conversations with a number of other historians when I published this book, and I get that reaction from a number of historians. Well, Lovell didn't think that Washington was, should have stayed in power, and so that's why I say I think he had he came on the wrong side of politics at the time.
Right. Bad press. He was somebody that was thinking for himself and critical. He had been trained to be critical in school. You know what? If you can be critical, you can figure out the right angles. And he didn't want to put all his chips on Washington. He wanted to, maybe look at other options.
Sure,
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah.
All right. Well, so in doing your research, sort of going back to that question I had before about writing fiction versus nonfiction, and leading into Mark's question here, was there a time when you were doing your research where you were trying to decide whether or not you would write fiction or nonfiction, or was this, I'm just always going to write a novel? I don't remember I'm sure we talked about this, but I don't remember.
guess for me, I probably just wanted to always write a novel because I knew so little about this story when I started. I thought, okay, where is my comfort level? My comfort level is writing fiction, okay, and putting as much into it as I can, because I think I can do that, but I don't think I could ever get enough material to do a biography. That just seemed like way over the top for me. And so that's why I did what I did. I felt more comfortable with it. And I felt like, who knew? I mean, I didn't know what I would uncover when I began researching. I didn't know what that was there to explore. And it certainly did come up to be enough that, probably could write a biography if that had been my angle to start with, but that wasn't the way I started.
Did you have like an aha moment when you were doing your research? Like, oh my God, this is amazing. I can't wait to tell this.
Oh yeah, I've had several. I really have. I've been totally amazed by this whole thing. For example, reading the letters that he wrote while Boston was in siege, the siege of Boston, the letters he writes to his friend Oliver Wendell and others, describing the situation, how they didn't have enough food, how those people in Boston were struggling, how they had cut down the trees on the Boston Common, how they had put the horses in the churches and used them as stables. All kinds of things had been, one after the other, brought horrible destruction to the city. And he had been just so overwhelmed and amazed at all this. It was really interesting to read his own words about that, and then to recognize a lot of the connections. For example, when I was able to speak for Fort Ticonderoga and do a webinar for them, I focused on the chapter where he meets Ethan Allen in jail in Halifax. And Ethan Allen, who is big and, boisterous and very talkative, comes in and tells his story. And James says, "Oh, well, so you were going to get these boats from the estate of Philip Skane, Colonel Philip Skane?" And Ethan Allen said, "Yep, that's where we got some of the boats." And he said, "Well, it was Philip Skane that General Howe wanted to exchange me for." And I'm going, whoa, this is like so many connections, it was, and then to realize that, Henry Knox had brought the cannon, of course, from Fort Ticonderoga to Boston, and had been blowing they had blown the British out of Boston by hammering them from the Dorchester Heights for a long time. And that had shook James up in jail in Boston. And he was hearing, the sound of cannonballs going everywhere while he is in jail. It was just one thing after another. It was incredible connections.
So one last thing, there's a lot of, we only have a couple of minutes left, and there's a lot of consternation these days in what's being taught in the schools. We're heading to our 250 semi-quincentennial of our nation. What do you think we should be doing with in teaching our history in schools?
Well, I think our duty and our responsibility is to tell the truth. We many people, for whatever reasons, are fearful of the truth. The truth shouldn't ever make us afraid. And, I know that our country has made errors, but I think we're big enough to own up to it. And some things give me hope. For example, people that use primary sources to teach history. I think that's great. There are lots of ways that people can use primary sources and bring history to life that way, truly bring it to life. And there are, primary sources, everything from decades and decades of newspapers out there to lots and lots of other ways that people can gather primary sources and use those to bolster and make real history as they are teaching it. And I know that that's going on.
Well, I think that's just terrific. And I, as we close down another episode here, another program of History Author Talks, I want to remind everyone that this program is recorded, is available at the past programs tab at History Author Talks. And you will find many wonderful programs at that site if you haven't seen them. So it's gives you a lot to do. I encourage everybody to support their local historic organizations, no matter where in the country they are. And I want to remind you also that you can go to History Author Talks and you will find a link on the it will be up there tomorrow with the video of this program. to purchase Jean's book with the proceeds to benefit the Sons of the American Revolution Research Library. So with that, I want to thank everyone for joining us this evening, my SAR compatriots and my friends and authors who have listened in. And I want to also thank Jean for her time and for writing the book. So I wish you the very best and have a wonderful evening, everybody. Good night.
You all very much.
Take care.